So, you're sitting the UKCAT exam this summer. You're going to need strategies for every section of the exam to do well. In this video, we're going to be covering all the question types you'll encounter and some useful tips for each section. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name's Rohan. I'm a first year medical student studying at the University of Cambridge. Today we're going to be continuing our Applying to Medicine series by going on a whistle-stop tour through all the question types in the UKCAT. This video is dense, there's a lot to cover. And there should be something for everyone, regardless what stage you're up to in preparation for the UKCAT exam. So, grab something to write on, and let's get cracking. There'll be timestamps in the description box below to jump through the video so you can re-watch some parts later on. Just quickly before we dive in, please watch my previous video on the UCAT, where I give you the golden rule for preparing for the UCAT. It's really important you see this video with the right perspective, so make sure you check out the video. Also, I want to give a mention to my friends at Tutor4, which is a company run by a couple of my friends at Cambridge. They are a tutoring company supporting students right from the 11+ exam all the way to medical school admissions tests and interviews. They have a proven track record of getting insanely high scores in the UCAT. They have kindly provided a free UCAT workbook which is linked in the description box below. It contains all the necessary information about each question subtype in the exam, and much of this video is based on this resource. So make sure you check out that document and go to their website for more information. Right, let's jump into the first section. So verbal reasoning is the first section of the UCAT exam. For timings, there are 11 text passages and 4 questions for each passage. This means you have just under 2 minutes per passage or just under 30 seconds a question. This is really tough, which is why the VR should not be underestimated. There are 2 types of questions. Type 1 questions are in the form true, false, and can't tell. And in type 2 questions, you're given a series of statements and you're asked to ascertain which one is true or false. The difficulty in VR comes from answering the questions within the allocated time. A good idea which the teachers at Tutor4 recommend is to have time markers for each section. This way you can keep track and adapt your speed accordingly. It may also help you decide if you have time to answer harder questions then and there, or to flag them and come back to them later. Just also be aware that there are more type 2 questions than type 1 in VR, so this should factor into your timings when you're practicing. To extract information quickly from the passage, make sure that you read the questions first. From the question, you can pick out a key word, which is usually a name, date, or statistic. Then scan the text for the key word and look at the sentence before and the sentence after. Your answer should be contained somewhere within these lines. In my experience, this is a much more efficient way of tackling the questions than reading the passage first. Harder questions may not include a proper noun in the stem of the question, so when you pick your keyword, make sure that you look for synonyms in the passage. Note that often for type 1 questions, if you're stuck, it's likely that the answer may be can't tell. The fact that you're stuck suggests that the information is not even mentioned in the passage, so don't be scared to pick can't tell. Also, please read the questions carefully. In particular, look out for words like not or except, because they can really catch you out when you're rushing and only focusing on the key words in the question. When practicing, learn the definitions of the command words so you know what the question is asking you. In particular, be suspicious of absolute terms such as always or never. They are very common in multiple choice questions and the answer is usually false, as there's usually some exception to the rule. If the passage asks for the author's opinion, be sure to read the last paragraph first, as this usually contains the strongest conclusion. And most importantly, refrain from using your own knowledge. Whatever facts are mentioned in the passage are true in the context of this exam. Ultimately, the limiting factor for this section is one's reading speed, because the questions themselves are fairly basic comprehension. Therefore, I'd recommend either doing a ton of timed practice, or whenever you're reading like a book or an article for your personal statement, you can speed read a section of say 300 words, then summarize the main content. This will help increase your reading speed whilst maintaining understanding. Now, let's move on to decision making. Decision making is the second section of the exam. For timings, you have 32 minutes to answer 29 questions. So that's just over a minute a question, so it's more relaxed. It's also one of the more intuitive sections, so I think you enjoy it. There are quite a few question types in decision making. There are syllogisms, where you're given a series of statements and you need to deduce what conclusions can and can't be made. Logic puzzles are where you're given a series of facts and you're asked to use them to deduce the answer. These can get a little bit mathsy. For these two questions, I highly recommend using the whiteboard and pen they provide to draw out a diagram. This distills all the text into something far easier to process. There are some excellent tutorials out there on YouTube by MedicMind, which go through work examples. For the strength of argument questions, your evaluative skills are being tested. It's important that you ignore your personal biases and try to be as objective as possible. The strongest argument should be both logical and relevant to the statements made in the stem of the question. There are data analysis questions. For these, make sure you pay very close attention to the units. There are Venn and Euler diagram questions. And finally, basic probability questions feature in DM. Because DM is so diverse, it's hard to suggest more general tips. For this section, it's probably more important than ever that you know what question types are coming up and you have personal strategies to tackle each one. All I can say is be sure to use the whiteboard to jot down key pieces of information when you answer the questions. Alright, let's move on to the third section. The next section is quantitative reasoning. You get 24 minutes to answer 36 questions, which equates to 40 seconds per question. So although the questions are no harder than GCSE level maths, it is really time pressured. My number one tip is to learn the keyboard shortcuts, which I'll bring up on screen for you somewhere here. It will save you so much time and it'll help you maintain accuracy even on tough calculations. Make sure that you practice them before the exam so you're comfortable with all the functions. The keyboards at the test centre will have a number pad on the right hand side, which should help you enter the keys quicker on the day. Even though I advocate using a calculator, there are still benefits on sharpening your mental maths. I suggest simple things like learning your times tables, square and cube numbers. Something that really helps is knowing the conversions for common fractions and percentages, which can be a bit awkward to input on the on-screen calculator. Also, while we're on percentages, they work both ways around. For example, 9% of 50 is the same as 50% of 9. A nice little hack for you. A good strategy is to look at the 5 answers available. If the numbers are close together, it usually means a more precise calculation is required. But if the numbers are orders of magnitude apart, it means you can use guesstimation to your advantage. Another important skill is to recognise how many steps a calculation will take. If you can see that a question will take 3 or more steps, your best guess is to guess, flag and move on, so you don't burn too much time. Remember, each question is only worth 1 mark, so you'd rather spend your time picking up all the easy marks and come back to the hard ones later. Also, try to avoid redundancies in your calculations. For example, if the question gives you data in miles and the final answer is in kilometers, you're better off doing all the calculations in miles, then do one big conversion to kilometers at the end, rather than converting all the individual values to kilometers at the start. You can do this by taking a few seconds before launching into calculations, just to work out what the most efficient way to get to the final answer is. Don't be put off by questions which show you 2 or 3 tables or graphs. Make sure that you read the question first so you can look at the data in a more targeted way. Be extra vigilant with the units in the data and then the answers, because usually some sort of conversion will be required. Finally, you'll notice that certain themes come up again and again, such as currency, crossing time zones, compound interest, speed time graphs, averages, area, etc. etc. It's a good idea to practice these questions to get familiar with the vocabulary that they use, as this can be a real stumbling block for some students. Alright, let's move on to abstract reasoning. Next up is abstract reasoning, the dreaded abstract reasoning. This is basically non-verbal reasoning from the 11+, but on steroids. I'm not really sure how this tests our potential to be a good doctor, but hey ho, it has to be done. So for timings, you have 55 questions to be answered in 13 minutes, so that's incredibly time pressured. There are 4 types of questions. Type 1 and Type 4 questions are very similar. You'll be given 2 sets, A and B, with 6 boxes each. Type 1 questions, you'll need to decide whether the question box belongs to set A, set B, or neither. And in Type 4 questions, you have to decide which question box belongs to set A or set B. Know that the majority of questions are either Type 1 or Type 4. To determine whether a box belongs to set A or B, you need to ascertain a rule which is present in each set. To do this, you need to look out for patterns. Many people use acronyms to help with this. For example, you may have come across scans in other tutorials, and Tutor4 recommend an even more detailed acronym called CAT-SPINE. However, in the heat of the exam, it's hard to systematically go through each of these acronyms for each question. Therefore, it's good to use these for untimed practice, Hopefully by the time it comes around to the exam, you'd have done enough practice so that you only need to use these acronyms for questions that you can't immediately answer. To help find the rule, look at the two simplest boxes in set A and try find a pattern which they obey. Once you find one, test this with the other boxes in the set. Note that set B will have a pattern which follows a similar principle. For example, in the following question, the rule for set A is that stripy squares are not allowed to touch each other. And set B follows the same principle, but this time it's white boxes which are not allowed to touch each other. Be aware of distractors in these questions. These are features in each box which are unrelated to the general rule. These tend to be very visual things such as colour or shape, which people tend to focus on first. If you're stuck on a question, briefly look away from the screen, then look from a little bit further back. This should give you a different perspective, clear your mind of some of the stress, and hopefully the patterns will jump out to you more naturally. If you're really struggling in AR, get a notebook and write down all the patterns you come across in your practice. Then go over this list so you know what to look for. In the exam, you also have 60 seconds before each section. So what you can do, you can get your whiteboard. In the preceding 60 seconds to AR, write down all the patterns you can think of, so this can serve as a checklist as you're going through the questions. Type 2 questions are easier to handle because you're looking for a pattern in a sequence. These patterns are typically things like rotations or reflections. Be careful not to jump straight to the answer after finding a rule, because there are usually 2 rules on these questions. But you can actually use the first rule to eliminate 2 of the answers. Then it should be easier to find the second rule from the remaining 2 answers. Also, watch out for alternating patterns. This is where boxes 1 and 3 follow one pattern, but boxes 2 and 4 follow another pattern. Type 3 questions are in the form A is to B as C is to X. They're pretty self-explanatory, and the techniques for answering these questions are very similar to those of type 2 questions. So although AR seems quite random, there are some themes which come up time and time again. For example, questions with arrows usually have patterns revolving around which direction the arrow is pointing. And questions with clocks are usually about the angles between the hands. Finally, let's move on to situational judgment. The final section of the UCAT exam is the situational judgment. This tests your ethical reasoning and principles from a variety of scenarios that you'll face as a doctor, a medical student, or just in general life. There are 69 questions to answer in 27 minutes, distributed across 20 scenarios, and it's actually more relaxed time-wise. There are 2 types of questions. In type 1 questions, you need to rank actions according to the level of appropriateness, with A being the most appropriate and D being the least appropriate. In type 2 questions, you need to rank the importance of a course of action in a given scenario. There are some general rules for certain scenarios which you should follow to demonstrate the principles of being a good doctor. These include, but are not limited to, prioritizing patient safety at all times, acting in the patient's best interests, maintaining patient confidentiality, obtaining patient consent, acting within the law. So for this, it's important to know the law over contentious issues such as euthanasia and abortion. Don't lie. Address incidents with those involved in an appropriate way before escalating the situation. Prioritizing emergencies over less urgent cases. And finally, to reassure patients. Make sure that you read the question carefully, as passages with different people often ask what course of action should be taken by a particular person. So make sure you're answering from the correct perspective. Also, bear in mind you can still get half a mark if you're only 1 level away from the correct answer. So if you're stuck, try simplify the answer to whether it's appropriate or inappropriate. So important or not important. If you're struggling on this section, it'll be a good idea to check out the Good Medical Practice document from the GMC. This clearly outlines what is expected of a doctor or dentist working in the NHS. And finally, it's worth knowing the 4 pillars of medical ethics. It will help you for those thornier ethical dilemmas, and it's a must-know for interviews. Man, that was a lot, but I hope I've given you value for the time you've spent watching this video. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments box below. That will really help the channel. Also, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you can be notified for more videos about applying to medical school in the UK. Finally, don't forget to utilise the Tutor 4 UCAT workbook and check out their website for more tips on the UCAT. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.